Hi, I'm Sarah from The Coming. Such a pleasure to be able to speak to you about this wonderful, fascinating, insightful documentary. Maybe you could just kick off with an introduction, a little bit about why you wanted to make Ailey and what people can expect when they watch it.
I was actually, I say that this film really found me. I was approached by, colleagues that I know from PBS, Steve Ives and Amanda Pollock of Insignia Films, and they said, we're looking for a director to make a film about Alvin Ailey, and my jaw dropped because I had been a longstanding fan of the company since I first saw them in college. And initially, for me, the real thrill was that I was going to be making a documentary that would be so steeped in movement language, where visuals would be so primary to telling the story, or that was the hope. But like so many people, I didn't know that much about Mr. Ailey himself. And so once I dove into that research and got to know more about him, it was just really exciting to be making a film that was really a story of becoming, looking at an artist and where he found his own calling, this kind of pull that dance had had for him. And then, somebody who was extraordinarily ambitious, but also sort of unsecure and on the margins. And so the kind of wrestling with his desire, but also the sort of tensions that surround his life as a queer Black man trying to build a company in the times in which he lived.
And what I think is so wonderful about it is that it's kind of poetic, and there's a flow to the documentary itself which kind of reflects the dance choreography that he created. So it's not just sort of, I don't know, a straight narrative and talking heads like you might find in another documentary, but it's very much, the music and the visuals all woven together. And, an extraordinary footage that you've obviously dug out back from, when he was a little boy in Texas, and some of those images and the house parties, right through to the stage performances and then of course, the modern day of them trying to prepare for the 60th anniversary. So how did you go about finding all that footage, and where do you even begin of putting that together to make a cohesive narrative?
Yeah, so I started actually as an archival researcher. That was my entryway into the world of documentary. So I'm really obsessed with archival and its possibilities and its limits. And in the case of Ailey, there were limits. He grew up with a single mother, very working class, working poor background. And so in fact, there are no reels of footage that are, home movie reels of him as a young child, or documenting his early life. And, what we stumbled upon in the film was really these audio recordings that he conducted in the last year of his life. And those became this extraordinary resource because it meant the film could be told largely in his own words, through his own perspective, and that we would be able to do the kind of filmmaking I love, which is to really place the viewer in the body of the subject and really see the world through their eyes. And so first, in terms of building his world, it was about looking for archive that exists that documented kind of everyday, ordinary Black life experiences, Black people in communities, social dances, backyard parties, the kind of wealth and richness of a culture that he then celebrates, so boldly in his works. And fortunately, in the last decade, there has just been an extraordinary preservation and digitization effort that has made all of this incredible material available to us. And so there was just these very kind of rich and textured pieces. In terms of the dance material, again, so lucky because dance companies don't always have the resources or do a great job of archiving their works. And because the Ailey company has toured so extensively in their career, we were able to use footage that, yes, was shot here in the United States, but also there was a trove of beautiful, beautiful dance footage that Denmark, Dance Mark Radio had, that RAI in Italy had. So it actually became a kind of global endeavor. We got stuff from Australia, the sort of whole gamut of the world that they had traveled in, and then, being able to access his collaborators, the closest collaborators, and really building, a kind of portrait of a man as understood by himself, and then those that worked closely with him. But the weave and then, I'm forgetting also the contemporary dance, which was such a critical piece for us, because he's somebody whose biography really never ends. He has this incredible legacy. He had this vision of, creating a space that would be available to younger choreographers, a kind of continuity of people being able to find their voice as he was able to. And so we, from the beginning, I felt like we had to have some example of, what the company continues to do today. So figuring out how to weave all of that was a whole other, part of our process. And I had the great fortune of working with an extraordinary editor who helped refine this film, and we, make it something that felt like a great evening of choreography in many ways, something that mirrored the kind of epic saga and an emotional journey that so many of his dance works do.
And there's so many themes that seem to come out of watching the documentary, because of course you can look at it through the lens of, the choreography itself and the different performances, and which ones of those he produced throughout his life. But then that's all within a context, and it's so interesting to kind of tease out all those themes. The fact that he didn't feel accepted in the dance world and basically had to build a world of his own in which to be able to create. But then even through that process, there's a quote at some point saying, actually, being an isolated Black creator, you can be used. And I think that can even be true today. Maybe you look at the Oscar win for Moonlight, are people patting themselves on the back too quickly to say, look, we're diverse, we're not racist, we're not any of these things. So it's really interesting to put his achievements in that context.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was something that was very important because of how profound it was, in the time in which he was working, where he really was, there were other Black choreographers, obviously, but at his level, he was the one and only. And I think, as you say, there were so many people in the world of dance who were happy to pat themselves on the back for having, this figure who we've accepted, and he's a part of us, and we understand him, and we appreciate the dance work he's doing. And then the kind of box that placed him in terms of always having to himself be representative of an entire people. And similarly, the way that even, I think, limited his creativity. It was sort of understood that, oh, now we have the person who does this and you'll stay in your lane. So creatively, he still wasn't given the kind of limitless possibilities that I think a white choreographer would have been given. And I think that's sadly very true today in terms of the way that we think about, the role that people of color serve in arts and culture, what we want to say, what we're allowed to say, the way in which we still continue to have to be, representative, and the way in which I think our experiences are still considered, not universal. I think his insistence that you could come and watch an evening of Ailey dance, and if it was one of the dances rooted in Black culture, there are universal human themes that are there about struggle and sorrow and loneliness and isolation and alien. These are just stories that all of us can relate to, and to be able to put yourself in a Black body to experience it as the viewer, I think that was so important for him, that the universal is not, in his case, the 1950s white nuclear family of, so I think he's really radical in that way.
And I think the other thing that comes out of the documentary is kind of looking at him as a figure, as kind of the tortured artist. So even though we're delving into so much about him and his work, there's still that element of him being an enigma, that, sort of a side to him that, you're constantly trying to find out more about, but you're not able to access. And I was thinking of the parallels of, not in at all in the same realm, but say Amy Winehouse or some documentaries of Whitney Houston, where you feel like maybe there's a pattern there where, sort of such success maybe comes at a price, or the idea of being sort of this tortured genius actually separates you from other people, and then that could bring its own issues. So do you think that was something interesting also to tease out in the film?
Yeah, it was a source of curiosity, of surprise for me, because when you were raised, when you see the Ailey company, or when you know anything about them, or you hear sort of the sort of general synopsis of what his work was about, it's a lot about transcendence and joy and community embrace. And he is always spoken of, as he is in the film, as this extraordinarily generous, figure. And there's this giving that he's doing, and so many of the dancers talked about, we'd walk into rooms and he would look at me and he found something in me, and you start to realize it's all in one direction. And where is he getting reciprocity in this, and is he making space to receive the same kind of care and generosity? And I think, interestingly, with Ailey, we didn't want to reduce it to any one thing. It's sort of, we set the pieces of his early childhood the way that we do, because we want you to sort of see him as a whole person. But that he didn't seem capable of allowing for intimacy, be that, friendships, romantic relationships, any of that, that he kept people at arm's length. And we wanted to get at more of why that was. And ultimately in the film, we just sort of allow that absence to exist and to live, and to let that kind of duality just stand there. I think it's something that people are very surprised to learn about him, as I was. It's like, how can a person give so much love and care, but how can they be so lonely in that endeavor? And what's interesting too is that moment where Mazazumi Chaya says in the film, he invited me into his apartment, but I wanted to keep him up here on a pedestal. And so at some point, I think, to what you're speaking of with the Whitney Houstons, with the Amy Winehouses, is that you end up sort of building a world in which now people are actually wanting to see you in a certain way. They don't want to take you down off of the pedestal that you've been placed on. And so the loneliness becomes further exacerbated, I think, at the point at which you achieve a certain kind of celebrity. And then the sort of imposter syndrome that's a part of that. He says in the film, coming from where I come from and then dancing on the Champs-Elysees, there's a real kind of gulf between those two worlds, and he couldn't reconcile them. And I think there's this question of, am I good enough to be valued in this way, that I think stalks and haunts him, until the very end.
And what do you hope ultimately people take away from watching it? Because I guess in some respects, there'll be people who already know his work, and this is a great opportunity to go back and revisit it. There'll be people that won't be familiar with it, and in that case, it's a great way to discover things about him. But there's also perhaps that element of, living on beyond, when you pass on. His dance company is still there. It's gone on to create something even bigger than himself. So there's kind of a message of optimism in there for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was just really profoundly amazed. You can know it because you know the name of the company, but to think about really how he was in the vanguard of a time, how forward thinking he was in terms of representation, let's say. I mean, we talk a lot now about centering the experiences of people of color, of, gender nonconforming people, all of, the so-called marginalized groups. And here he was in the 50s saying, no, who I am and where I come from is valuable, is matters. It matters significantly, and it matters enough that it needs to be kind of presented on the global stage. So that felt just very profound, to be reminded that, these battles are long and we've been waging them for a while, and we have a great figure like Mr. Ailey to kind of look back on in terms of strategy. His leadership, his sense of wanting to maintain a sense of the past, create his own works, and then also make space for future generations. I think that is just something to be, honored. And then, I really I wanted the name to have significance in terms of what he did. And I wanted people to understand the kind of the vulnerability. He's bigger than a photograph, these beautiful photographs of him. You know, he was a fragile and vulnerable and sensitive and tactile person with kind of all of this stuff in him. And it was the arts that really, I think, allowed him to express himself. You know, there's a kind of expressive possibility for him in dance and being on the stage that he couldn't have anywhere else in his life. And I wanted that to be, you know, tethered back to this company that we celebrate. And love, you know, I think there was a great deal of love ultimately in what he was doing. And so for me, this is kind of like a love letter of thanks, you know, back to somebody who's made such meaningful work that, you know, I feel like has been transformative for me, you know, in a different set of, you know, a different kind of arts discipline, but nonetheless was so meaningful to where I am today.
And obviously you can see someone like him as a complete trailblazer, but do you think that progress has been made since his era? Do you think he would look back now and say like, oh, wow, look, you know, things are so different than when I was first starting out my day? Or do you think, you know, there'd be disappointment there that, wow, okay, we've still got such a long way to go?
Yeah, we made this film, you know, starting at the end of 2017, we pitched it out and it finally got released in, you know, 2021. So it was a long time period and a lot happened in the world. And I think, you know, just thinking about the you know, horrible brutality that happened in 2021, the sort of violence against Black bodies, you know, I think when I speak to people of his generation, they are profoundly saddened and disturbed at a kind of feeling like there's been a reset. There was a great sense of optimism. We are not living in the same ways that we were in his time. There has been progress in so many ways, but we still continue to sort of fight these same battles. And so I don't know, I think he would have been able to be a much fuller and sort of whole human being in 2021 had he lived to this time, and that would have been great. I think about his queer identity and the fact that he would not have had to kind of keep that closeted in the ways that he felt were necessary at his time. But I think, you know, the struggle continues.
And can you quickly tell us what you might be working on next?
Yes, it hasn't been announced yet, so I can't say too much about it, but I am working on a music documentary series. So it's exciting and I'm in the thick of it.
Well, amazing. Well, I've taken up too much of your time already, but it was such a pleasure to speak to you. Thanks so much for sharing all that with us, and can't wait for people to get out and see this documentary and of course your future projects. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.